And it's the reason the UK was just stratospherically ahead of the rest of the world when it came to the research during COVID. The UK was just phenomenal compared to every other nation in the world. We were better, faster, the research that we produced was more important, and it saved millions of lives across the world. It was because we've got that embedded system.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way.
My guest today is Matt Westmore, Chief Executive of the UK's Health Research Authority and Adjunct Professor at the University of Southampton. The HRA was established in 2011. Its core purpose is to protect and promote the interests of patients and the public in health and social care research. Matt was a guest on this podcast in 2021, just 8 months after he had become CEO. In the 3 years since then, the authority has focused on implementing a comprehensive strategy designed to make it easy to do research that people can trust. I've invited him back to tell us how that's going and what the future holds for the HRA. Matt, welcome back to the Purposeful Strategist podcast. Really great to have you back.
Oh, thank you, Belden. It's a great pleasure to be back as well.
Good. So HRA's vision is for high-quality health and social care research that improves people's health and well-being. Can you remind listeners what the authority does to achieve that vision?
Yeah, I'd be really pleased to. So we're an arm's length body of the UK government. Specifically, we report into the Department of Health and Social Care, and we're a regulator for scientific research intended to understand, improve, or deliver health and social care services. So that's the broad landscape that we're working in. So things to do with scientific research related to the NHS or adult social care or similar issues. And ultimately, of course, we're in this for the benefit of society, patients, the public, people in receipt of adult social care. The next point to make is that health and social care research is really, really important. It's important to us as individuals. We rely on it in terms of the quality of healthcare we receive or social care receive. It's important to society. It represents a very large part of our economy, which means that it supports a lot of jobs as well as inward investment. But it's also really, really complicated. It's really difficult to do well and get right. And so you've got those two problems, if you like, in the sense that it's really important and it's really difficult to do well. And that's why the HRAs was created, in order to make it as easy as possible to do research in the first place. But secondly, that research is obviously trustworthy. It's good research. It's ethical. It's safe. So that's the sort of the problem set we're trying to resolve. In terms of the specific things we do, because research is so complicated and because it's so important, there's a whole bunch of approvals you need in order to be allowed to do research that involves patients, for example, or their tissue samples or their blood results or their genetic code or their data or whatever it might be. There's a whole bunch of approvals you need to get to be allowed to do it. And then there's a whole bunch of organisations that have to be involved in delivering research. It's quite a complicated thing to set up and do. So the HRA is involved in all of that, but specifically we run some of those approval services ourselves. So research community will apply to us and we'll look at it, we'll look at their plans and we'll advise them on how to improve them and ultimately say that they're allowed to do the research or not. We specifically do that in an area called research ethics, which is really focused on the way people are informed about research that they might choose, and it has to be a choice for them to get involved with, the way they're treated during that research to ensure that they're kind of well looked after and it's safe and they fully understand what's going to happen. But we also are involved in the use of patient data. So people's medical data, clinical data in terms of their health state or their experience and journey through the NHS. If researchers want to use that, then they'll have to come to us.
You've a couple of times said it's complex. And if I've got it right, you're not the only body that's involved in all this. Do you also cover that research, when you get to the end of it, is actually going to tell us something useful, or are there other people who worry about that?
The answer is yes and no.
Oh, okay.
It's a really complicated process involving multiple organisations. But one of the roles of the HRA is to try to simplify that system. It's a very formal responsibility, as well as approving research according to a sort of a narrow set of considerations in comparison to the whole set of approvals the research needs. We also have a formal responsibility to try to connect the whole system up. So working with all the other agencies and bodies across the research sector to ensure that that's as streamlined and as coherent and as simple a process as possible. So, all public bodies should be doing that. We have a formal responsibility. It's in legislation and the like to actually do it and to make a difference there. One of the things we do, for example, is we run the single IT system, the digital service that researchers apply into to gain approvals from multiple organisations. And now that's a really important service. It's a website you go to and you fill out, you submit your details and the like. So it provides a really important function. But the other really important point about it is in order for us to all use the same system, we've all got to agree on the same policies and strategies and rules by which we're going to assess research. So if you had a situation where, for example, in our approval services, we said to the researchers, well, we think you should change your research to do these things. And then one of the other agencies further down the line said, well, we think you should change to do these things. Well, we've now given the research community a problem because they've got to somehow navigate between what could be conflicting advice. So because we're all using the same system, we actually have to make sure that we're going to say broadly coherent things to the research community. And in fact, in that example, we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves before we go back and confuse the researchers by giving them conflicting guidance on what they might do. So we absolutely get involved in connecting the whole system up. Having said that, each of those organisations has very specific responsibilities within that system, just like the HRA does. So within the UK, we worry about the research. There's another organisation called the Medicines Healthcare Regulatory Authority, the MHRA. They will licence or not medicines and devices for potential use. They say that, yep, these are safe and whatnot. There's another organisation called NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, that people may have heard of. They say whether or not it's cost effective for the NHS to actually use these devices or drugs. So there's a whole process and pathway by which we go from the initial spark of innovation. Someone said, oh, fantastic, there's a discovery in a laboratory or they notice something within a patient cohort through to this is a new treatment that I might receive if I go to my doctors.
It sounds like a tricky job there to balance, if I could put it this way, making sure that nothing kind of falls through the cracks with making sure it's possible to actually get some really great new treatment through all the hoops.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the scientific process itself and the development of new treatments is an inherently lossy process. We try out lots of things at earlier stages. So whether that's, in the laboratory or early phases of research, only something like, I think is 5% will make it from those early stages into a treatment, which is then licensed for use. And then there's an additional question as to whether that's better than current treatments and worth it, the NHS actually commissioning it. So it's a very lossy process. And most of that is because of the scientific uncertainties. We don't know what the right way is to treat certain conditions. And therefore, you try different things. You pick up these positive signals and they end up not working in later phases. And that's all perfect. Clearly there's lots of work going on to try to improve that process. But that in a sense is fine. That's about the scientific process of discovery. What we want to make sure is that the administrative and regulatory processes are not a cause of that, either the length of that timeline, because, treatments delayed is benefits denied to patients, or it doesn't itself cause things to drop out because, the process is too difficult or too costly to navigate. So that are the bits that we really, really try to bear down on. How do we make the process as streamlined and as simple and as low burden as possible so that if things don't work out, it's because of the scientific kind of discovery process itself.
Not because the administration was too difficult.
And it was in the past. And it's, in a way, that's why the HRA was set up, was because, most of what we do today happened in the past. So we weren't set up in a way to do the things we do. What we were really set up to do was to transform the way in which it's done, the regulation and governance framework. So we were set up following a report that said, look, this is all too complicated, difficult, and it's not adding value to patients and the public. We need this new organisation to try to kind of resolve these issues so that where there are delays, it's because important scientific research is going on, or where things fall out of the system, it's because we have realised that these things don't work. They look promising, but they don't work, and we found that out from a scientific process. The HRA was set up to try to make that process as streamlined as possible, which is what we still try to do today.
Yeah. Kind of related to that, if I've got it right, the objective of your current 3-year strategy has been to earn and maintain people's trust in research, and sort of 2 guiding principles, which I really love. One is include, that research is done with and for everyone, which I'm sure has an enormous set of challenges. And then accelerate, which is to some extent, I think, what we've been talking about, at least accelerated as in let's remove some delayers.
Yeah.
So I gather there's milestones against all that. How do you measure some of those things, and then how are you doing against it all?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's one of the things that, when I'm reflecting on how that whole process has gone, one of the things which we didn't quite nail at the time was, how will we measure success? In a comprehensive sense. So there are things that we already measure and make perfect sense, and we can see the improvements we're making. So, for example, the accelerate priority is all about making it quicker to go from the first time you interact with a regulatory agency, us probably, or maybe one of the other agencies, we're pretty early on in the process, to the first patient or adult in social care that's asked whether or not they want to get involved in a piece of research. So that period of time, that's what we're trying to bear down on, because we know that that's a major problem across the world, actually. The UK is not particularly different. It's a major part of the process. Well, we can measure that. That's inherently measurable, and we do measure it, and there are certain requirements to parts of that process. They're measured at the national level, so we can see how we compare to other countries around the world in terms of how long that time takes. And there are some very specific commitments that we've made as an organisation. Some of it's in legislation, that certain parts of the process can only take so long. So we can see real progress there. We've knocked months off the time it takes to go through that kind of regulatory approvals process. Now, that's not just us. That's us working in partnership with other agencies. It's remarkably shorter now than what it was before. So we can pick up those sorts of changes. As an organisation, one of the approvals that we run, this research ethics, well, that's the thing that in legislation shouldn't take longer than 60 days. It's got a very specific kind of measurement on it. And we've always struggled, to be fair, to always hit that target. Well, in the last 12 months, we've hit it every single month. And that's against the backdrop of, coming out of the pandemic and resource constraints and funding constraints and all kinds of other problems in the system. So it's really quite remarkable that we're able to do that. So we can measure those sorts of things. We do that really well. What's harder to measure are some of those things around inclusion. It's harder to even know what's the right thing to measure. What would good look like in terms of whether or not research is inclusive? So that, I think we've got probably a bit more work to do to figure out exactly what does good look like in that space. I can see us making a difference. Like, if we're being honest, we're better at measuring kind of activity rather than outcomes in that sort of sense, because it's really difficult to know what the right outcome is. But I can see that we've made real improvements in terms of some of the conversations we've been having. I'll give you a couple of tangible examples. Within the HRA, we've established a new committee that reports to our board, which is drawn from across our community of volunteers. So a lot of the work of the HRA is done by volunteers. Last year, our volunteers put in 75,000 hours worth of volunteering time to support the process. 75,000.
When I hear somebody talk volunteers, I perhaps very incorrectly get the idea of people sort of turning up on a part-time basis to clear a field of rubbish or whatever. If I've got it right, your volunteers are very experienced senior scientific types.
Yeah.
What are they doing?
So they're sitting on our committees. So picture the process. A researcher wants to do a piece of research that either involves NHS patients, their blood or tissue samples, their data. So they put together a really detailed description of the research, and then they submit it to the regulators in order to decide whether or not, that should be allowed to proceed or whether it could be improved. That process is done by these applications come in, and then they are sent to standing committees of these experts in the system. So there'll be experts by way of their professional background, so clinicians or researchers, or there could be kind of experts by experience. They're, lay people, patients, and people who have experience of healthcare. So we have quite diverse committees. We've got 64 of these committees in England, and there are others that we work with in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And they're all volunteers. So these people will meet monthly, and they'll look at a number of these applications and, first of all, provide advice to the researchers and say, look, we think you need to improve this or that for this to be kind of better research. And secondly, they decide yes or no, can you proceed? We also work with other groups of people on a more kind of case-by-case ad hoc basis. So we say, look, we're developing this new policy that, that we want to get a patient input from, and you kind of advise us, come to a workshop, those sorts of things. But the majority of it is people attending these committees on a monthly basis.
Yeah. In that journey over the last 3 years or so, any surprises, anything that's either been tough or surprisingly easier?
It's a great question. I think in the easier than I thought it was going to be category. So the thing to realise about our current strategy is that it was quite a shift in, I'm going to say, personality of the organisation. So it's worth saying that the organisation when I started was a fantastic organisation, didn't need fixing or anything like that. It was a wonderful organisation, brilliantly led by my predecessors and full of some amazing people. But we certainly suffered from that problem that public sector organisations often suffer from. And remember, this was in the middle of COVID as well, that we spread ourselves too thinly. We try to do too much. And so one of the things I was trying to bring about with the new strategy was this really focused set of priorities, which of course then means that you're saying to the world, we're going to do these things and we are not going to do those. I think one of the hardest things in both leadership and strategy is not what you say yes to, it's what you say no to. That's the trick, isn't it? And so the thing that I was surprised at, I think was easier than I thought, was that people came along with us. We didn't get a lot of, people were disappointed about some of the things, which we then said that we can't do this for now. The other important point is it's quite a short strategy so that we could say, look, not yet, not now, but maybe in the future. And we certainly never said not ever. So it was a surprise that how accepting key partners were of that. And I think it's because we had a clear message and they understood it. I think the other thing that surprised me slightly, in a sense, is our focus on both inclusion and accelerating the approvals pathway. We were just ahead of the whole sector switching on to this being a really, really important issue. And I'm not saying they switched onto it because of us. We read the future, if you like, a bit quicker than anyone else. And of course that's gratifying. We got that right. But of course, then that made it much easier to deliver, because then it wasn't just, Matt says this is important or the HRA says it's important. It's like, everyone's saying the same sorts of things. And of course, we were there ready to say, actually, that's what we're focused on. And then that made it a lot easier to deliver some of the things that we wanted to deliver, particularly those ones that involved harder choices.
Yeah. When you say the industry kind of shifted in the same direction you were planning to go already, was that around this include and accelerate agenda, or was it one or the other or something different?
Both to a certain extent, certainly on Accelerate, particularly commercial clinical trials in the UK. We see a lot of commercial clinical trials. So these are trials which are funded and run, sponsored by a pharmaceutical company or whatnot. Actually, we see far more studies which are funded and sponsored by either charity funding or the public sector. So actually, that's the bigger number. But certainly the focus has been on commercial clinical trials to a certain extent. And that whole process of, these sort of government reviews and reports with recommendations were saying the same sorts of things that we were saying. And of course, we were involved in those reviews as well. And it was all about, look, one of the problems we've got across the world, and it seems particularly acute in the UK as we are recovering from the impact of COVID on the research sector, that it's taking too long. It's too difficult to go from getting your regulatory approval, so the HRA says yes, to that first patient being asked if they want to get involved in research. So that really helped. On Include, it was a little bit more mixed. The focus of certainly the previous government was less on these sorts of issues than had been previously, and certainly compared to the current government. And as an arm's length body of the government, whatever our personal views on it, we're here to deliver government policy. And so there was less sort of impetus for those sorts of topics. However, more broadly, it was still seen as a very important part of research, and particularly an important part of research that can make a difference, because if you've got the right representation in studies, then it's more likely to come up with useful answers that are more likely to be useful to the communities you treat. And that was never challenged by any kind of minister or government. But what we have done now in this whole timeline of previous government and new government, we've been working on new clinical trials regulations. So these are the sort of like the laws of the land that say this is how you should run clinical trials. And they need replacing, partly because of exiting the EU a few years ago, partly because things have just changed in the clinical trial landscape. We do clinical trials differently today than we did last time the legislation was looked at. For example, the attention to the diversity and inclusion within clinical trial participant communities. We're into an implementation period, so it's not actually in force yet, but over the next few months, we'll be talking a lot about how do we ensure the right levels of diversity and inclusion in clinical trials, and it will be a matter of law.
Yeah. If I've got it right, you're soon going to be looking again at sort of the next 3-year strategy. What are you thinking about in terms of the process? Who's going to be involved? And also it sounds like the last 3 years have been I don't want to make it sound like it's been without its challenges, but a pretty good run.
Yeah.
You've made good progress. You've got the industry behind you. Do you see the next 3 years as sort of pretty much same again? Or do you think it needs a new personality, a new shift in focus?
So we are in the middle of, at the moment, of drafting the new strategy. The current one was 3 years and comes to an end this year. So that's why we're sort of going through this process. The first thing to say about that is that it was deliberately a short strategy because of the dynamic environment that we're in. The realities of, who knows what the world's going to need from us in 4 or 5 years' time. I wanted that sense of urgency to the work that we were doing. And I also wanted to be able to say to organisations, look, we're going to do these things, but we're not going to focus on these other things, which we completely understand are important, but we just can't focus on for the time being. And a 3-year window felt like a window which is acceptable to our stakeholders. So that's why we're in the process. In terms of the work that's going on at the moment, I think what we're settling on is that the broad focus of the strategy is still relevant. The key elements are this idea that our mission is to make it easy to do research that people can trust. Still remains a really important statement for us, that we see that our role is to make it easy to do research, but that research has to be trustworthy. And so that balance of we're going to be a real enabling force of research because we want research to happen. It's so important to the UK and to patients and the public that we'll do everything we possibly can to make it as easy as possible for researchers to do research. But fundamentally, it's got to be the right research and that you've got to have this golden thread of trust. That remains. I'd be very, very surprised if after this work, we come up with some different mission or even a different, sort of wording for it. The focus on accelerating the approvals process and simultaneously improving inclusion, I think will remain. I think we'll probably describe it differently because we have different priorities from government. We can have a closer link now with the government's health and growth missions, and there's a lot of work going on to see what the future of the NHS needs to look like. There's a whole 10-year planning process going on. So I think we'll describe these things differently, but I think fundamentally it will boil down to, look, the thing we're still trying to fix is to make this approvals process much more streamlined and faster and easier to do and low burden, and that inclusivity in everything to do with research is still the focus. And then what it comes down to is what are the very specific things we're going to do over the next 3 years under those headings, if they still exist as headings, I don't know. But obviously we've achieved certain things and we want to kind of say, well, what next? But I think it's probably going to be in those spaces.
And if you can, walk us through the process you're kind of in the middle of. Take us into the room if you can. Who's in there? What sort of activities are ongoing?
Yeah, so we've got a whole program split into a number of work streams, and we've got various people from across the organisation leading those work streams who are really at the process at the moment. We're in a kind of very exploratory phase, a sort of divergent phase of trying to think about under each of these work streams, what could we do? What might the world want us to do? And that we're doing by a whole series of, it depends on the work stream. Some of it is more desk-based, but most of it involves conversation, talking to internal and external partners about, if we were to do more in, sort of social care, for example, what would be the problems that we should be thinking about and approaching? What solutions might we be to build a kind of a long list, if you like? So that's the process we're in at the moment. It's very exploratory. It's very dispersed across the organisation. So then there'll be a process of converging that down and saying, okay, what do we really want to focus on? So that we're going to put greater effort behind a smaller number of priorities than sort of try to work across too many things. That will be a process of conversation within the organisation, and again working with stakeholders before we start to kind of prioritise that down through the final stages of taking it back to my executive team and the HRA boards to make those final decisions. And that will happen over the next 2 or 3 months.
Interesting. One of the things I'd love to get your take on is, the UK is a powerhouse in the whole world of life sciences, particularly adjusted for population size and all punches way above its weight. And it's meant to be, maybe not perfect, but a pretty good place to do research. Just curious, what do you see going forward around that? Do you see that as becoming even more so, or perhaps being under threat? And where's the HRA in the middle of that? Is that your job in any way to try and influence or not?
What we care about is health and social care related research. You could talk about other areas of academic research where we do punch well above our weight. Clinical research is definitely one of those. And so it's a fantastic place to do research today. And we're high on the various metrics that, people might use to try to quantify this in terms of, the number of studies that happen in the UK per capita. It is also a highly competitive global environment. And one of the things that we've seen over a certain number of years is that it has become much more competitive globally. It's becoming a much more fungible kind of activity in a sense that choices are being made in kind of global boardrooms as to whether to cite this research in the UK or in Eastern Europe or in America or China, whatever it might be. So it's becoming very, very competitive. So even to stand still and maintain our kind of current position, it takes a lot of work and thought and improvement, because all countries are going through this process of saying, look, we want more of this research. It's important to our kind of economies. It's important to our patients. It's important to our populations. We want it. So just to stand still, we've got a lot of work to do there. What I would say, though, is that there's a lot of evidence that shows that healthcare systems and institutions that engage in research have better clinical outcomes irrespective of whether or not patients get involved in that research. So this isn't about you getting a better treatment. It's an institution that does research tends to be better at delivering routine clinical care as well. So the whole system doing more research, irrespective of the findings of that research, is better at providing clinical care, which is why we are really passionate about pushing this message that it should be ever more embedded. It's part of how we provide good quality clinical care in the UK. I also think that the UK has got some real kind of advantages and clear strengths that other countries don't have that we could do more in, as well as the sort of scientific base for the UK, which is a clear strength. The fact that we have, I would argue, the most integrated health research system in the world, in the sense that the clinical research system is embedded within national health services, the NHS in England and equivalents in, Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. There's no other country that has that offer where you've got such an embedded research activity happening in a kind of a whole population sort of setting. And it's the reason the UK was just stratospherically ahead of the rest of the world when it came to the research during COVID. The UK was just phenomenal compared to every other nation in the world. We were better, faster. The research that we produced was more important, and it saved millions of lives across the world. It was because we've got that embedded system, and that gives you access to a diverse patient group, which is for the benefit of the who receives these treatments in the end. It's those patient groups, and so it's obviously great for researchers to come in and be able to access that, and it's obviously great for those communities to be able to involve in that research. So I think there's lots we can do where we can actually be even more competitive, have even more inward investment, which is obviously great for our patients, but also great for our economy.
Yeah. Would I be right in imagining that this focus on inclusion, making sure you've got a diverse patient population, actually helps with all that in a way that might seem difficult for countries that are less diverse to start with?
Yeah. So in the UK, because we have a National Health Service, because we have national sort of data sets, so we can kind of know and understand the patient community, and because the clinical research system is embedded within that health service, it's not something that happens in another institution, another big building kind of, around the corner. It's happening in our hospitals, in our GP surgeries, in primary care settings, in our care homes. It means that not only are those diverse patient groups there, they're much easier to engage with and work with than many, many other countries. And as I say, that's obviously good for the research community. Particularly commercial research organisations are much more interested today about accessing diverse patient groups than perhaps they have been in the past. But it's also great for those communities because we want those treatments to represent, far too many treatments of the past were never, sort of developed and evaluated on the patients that then end up receiving them. We can engage the right people safely and ethically in research that perhaps in previous years we weren't so comfortable doing.
You've talked a number of times about the, sort of being embedded. If I'm a patient, how do I experience the embeddedness of it? And what would it look like if it wasn't embedded?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. So I'm going to describe probably a perfect scenario that doesn't yet exist. It happens in places, it doesn't happen everywhere, which is one of the things that we're focused on. So, for example, you might be unlucky enough to be seeing your GP or being referred in to see a consultant at a hospital as part of your clinical care. So it's just, there's something I'm worried about, I've gone to see my doctor. In that interaction, your healthcare professional should be having a conversation with you that says there's this research study going on that you might be interested in participating in. And then you start a process of explaining what that research is, the balance of cost and benefits, what's particularly involved in research, so that you as the patient can make an informed choice as to whether or not you want to get involved. And if the answer is no, then clearly that's perfectly acceptable and justified. It's all about personal choice. And if you say yes, then you go on into a research process. So that whole interaction is happening as part of your experience of clinical care. If you then say, yeah, actually, I would like to hear more about this, or I want to get involved in this research, then you might end up going and being seen by a research team within the hospital or within the primary care setting. So, for example, in my local GP practice, in the GP practice where you go to, sort of see your GP, in the same building, there's an academic kind of primary care team who do research in primary care, who are themselves GPs, for half their week and half the week doctors. So it's all part of the same experience. So in other words, it's not a process by which there are these, sort of big, fancy, scary buildings that somehow you've got to find out they exist and you go to. It's something you experience as part of your routine care. And the reason that's important, not only does that make it more accessible for us as sort of citizens, but it means that the research itself is more pragmatic. So there have been many, many examples in the past where something looks like it works amazingly well in a highly specialised research institute and environment. Then when then patients start to receive it as part of normal clinical care because it's gone through all its approvals, it doesn't work, or it doesn't work as well as you think it, because the complexity of the real world is not the same as a big fancy research institute with loads of professors around and things like that. So the pragmatism of it is really important. One of the other things which is really interesting at the moment is you can now find out about research which might be relevant to you from the NHS app. There's a place on the app that says, here's a clinical trial you might be interested in. And now the more we can kind of bring the offer of research to patients and participants who can then make an informed choice as to whether they want to engage or not, I think is a really exciting development of the further kind of embedding of research in our normal experiences of health and social care in the UK.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can see how that would work. Changing the subject a little bit, any advice you might give to other leaders as they think about purpose and strategy?
This is something that I'm still learning how to do, but I've learned that it's important as part of the process we've been through. And it stems from this realization that, the most interesting, the most impressive, inspiring, and certainly I think the most successful leaders are those who know not how to be right, but how to be wrong. It's getting comfortable about not knowing the answers and actually someone challenging your point of view and saying, actually, I think you're wrong on that. It's a really difficult space. But I think that's what I've realized over the last 3 years. Be prepared to be challenged, be prepared to be wrong. And there's a really subtle but important reason for that, is that when it comes to senior leaders and executive teams, you should be occupying yourself with complex problems that require complex judgments, not just complicated questions. And the difference between those two things is that, if something's complicated, like, I don't know, the design of a rocket to the Mars or something, well, get an expert there and they'll tell you what the right answer is. That's not true of most of the challenges that we face as senior leaders. There is no right answer. There are good answers and there are bad answers, but there's no right answer, and it's certainly not one that you can calculate. So you need to be able to bring together a group of people who have different perspectives, different points of view, different values, different experiences, and for them to be able to disagree. So to be able to disagree with their colleagues and be disagreed with, and yet come out the end where everyone is happy with the answer, and that's something we've been working on as a team within the HRA, working out how can we be wrong about things rather than how do we need to prove to someone that we're right about them.
Matt, I think that's actually a great note to end on. Let me again thank you for sharing both your experience and your journey and kind of what's been easy and what's been hard. And perhaps in another few years, we'll have a chance to have you back and tell us how the next bit's going.
I'll be delighted to. It's been a really, really interesting discussion, and it's a great opportunity to sort of just step back and reflect on what we've achieved over the last few years and where we go next.
Again, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Belden.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.